Hello, welcome. I am Carrie McKinnon at the Solvang Library, and today we're hosting a live presentation with time for a Q&A afterward from guest speaker Conrad Caspari. Book to Action is a community reading program of the California Library Association, supported by the United States Institute of Museum and Library Services. And the book we're reading this year is George Takei's They Called Us Enemy, a memoir in graphic novel format of his and his family's forced removal from their home and internment with other Japanese Americans in a detention camp during World War II. All of our programs and events for Book to Action are focusing not only on the history and experiences of persons during this period, but on the themes of diversity and inclusion, or exclusion in many cases, in our world today. We're now in our 10th week of programming, and we have seen some amazing speakers, had book discussions, seen films, and we've even done crafts. And you can find recordings of the previous presentations by June Aochi Burke, Dr. Sigrid Toy, illustrator Harmony Becker, and Dr. Russell Endo on the Goleta and San Ynez Valley Library's YouTube channel. The program will continue in July with a showing of an award-winning documentary called Children of Internment by Christina Wagner and Joe Crump, and with a talk by Dr. Kent Halden on the oral histories of 3 Japanese American communities in Santa Barbara County. We would like to thank the California Center for the Book, the Friends of the Library of Santa Ynez Valley, and in particular, our partner organization, the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition. And before introducing our speaker, I want to encourage you to participate in our Q&A after the talk by logging into either your Google account if you're watching on YouTube, or your Facebook account if you're watching there. Or if you don't want to log into either of those things, you can submit questions or comments via email to solvanglibrary@cityofgoleta.org. All right. Our speaker today, Conrad Caspari, was born in Chicago, but his parents moved to Bonn in Germany when he was 2 years old. His schooling started in Germany, then he moved to London, England, and New York before finishing school back in Germany again. Conrad went on to study at Oxford University in the UK, where his first Bachelor of Arts degree was in philosophy, politics, and economics, and then his Master's of Science was in agricultural economics. His career has been largely focused on providing consultancy advice on a wide range of issues relating to food, agriculture, related trade, environmental, health, and other policy issues to European Union institutions, national governments, companies, and non-governmental organizations. And this work was initially mainly concerned with Europe, but latterly worldwide out of offices in the UK and Belgium. Conrad is now mostly retired from this work and pursues other interests, especially including writing. And he is on the board of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition. So welcome, Conrad. We are super thrilled to have you with us today. Let me pull you up. Hi.
Hi there. Well, thank you very much, Carrie, for the introduction, and thanks also to the Goleta and Santa Ynez Valley Libraries for organizing this book to action event about George Takei's book, They Called Us Enemy, the excellent book, and providing this platform. So that's much appreciated. And before I start, I'd also like to thank the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition for the support they've provided over the last few years, especially Professor Russ Endo for the excellent research he did in the National Archives over many months to help clear up some of the facts and the background concerning my father's experience. So with that I'd like to show you my first slide. And explain what I'm going to try and do in the next 40 minutes or so. So, I'm going to be talking about my father's story. He was called Fritz Caspari, and this is the story of his detention in the Second World War. So if we go to the first slide there, then I'll say what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how I come to be talking here, some background on my father's history before he came to the States, really, when, how, and where he was interned, his experience of detention, and how he came to be released, and then I'll give you some concluding thoughts and comments. So if we move on to the first slide, or well, before we go to that, I'll just explain a bit about how I come to be talking here. So really, my father didn't talk a great deal about his experience in Tuna Canyon and while he was detained, until we encouraged him late in life when he did an interview with a journalist about 12 years ago, and he did a recorded interview. So that was one thing which informs this talk. He also did I'm going to read out some of the things he said at that time. He also did a short film about his life just before he died, and I'll give a link to that later. As far as I'm concerned, my interest was particularly strongly aroused when I started to be particularly interested about 20 years ago, when one of my sisters who was living in Washington, recovered my father's FBI file under a Freedom of Information request. And that was about a 120-page document, a fascinating document, and I'm going to be sharing some extracts from that. The third thing which got me going on the subject was the chance discovery of a very moldy folder of correspondence and memorabilia I found in a basement about 5 years ago. It was a rusty old filing cabinet which mainly had a whole load of bank stubs from 1945, and I thought, oh, why hasn't this been got rid of? But then in the middle of it, there was a very moldy old file dating back to 1945, which said it was about correspondence about detention, my father's detention. He'd probably put it there back in 1945 and never looked at it again. So it was rather an amazing thing to find. And that in turn prompted me to get in touch with the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition, and it initiated an exchange of information with them. More personally, why am I doing this? I think I've always been interested in my father's experience, both as a way of getting to know him better, but also because of the light his experience shed on life in Nazi Germany and in the US and afterwards. So I think, and how that relates to our current times, I think that's quite an interesting thing. But to get to my father's background, and start properly. So as you can, he was born in Switzerland in 1914 to German parents. His father worked as an engineer, working for a Swiss manufacturing company. It was interestingly, in the light of what I'm going to talk about, his father actually went on a rather ill-advised business trip in 1914 and was interned in Russia for over 4 years in the First World War. So seems to run in the family. Anyway, my father then was educated in Heidelberg in Germany during the period of the Weimar Republic, which was the system of government introduced after the end of the First World War. As opposed to being an imperial government, a monarchy, it was a democracy, which was a fundamental difference to what had gone before in Germany. It was a pretty fragile democracy, but my father's entire schooling was during that period of the Weimar Republic. And one thing which was unusual about him, or maybe it was quite common, because the times were very lively in terms of the politics, and he became very interested in politics. He was a very strong supporter of the democracy which was democracy which was prevailing in Germany at the time. And in the school playground, they used to run around the playground having little badges on their lapels until it was banned, saying which parties they supported. So they had their playground fights at 10 or 11, and they represented different political parties. So they might have been monarchists, or they might have been other parties. So that shows how politicized the environment was. And he was certainly very politicized. He started intensely reading newspapers apparently when he was about 11. And he certainly got a hang for what the politics was about, and especially what was going to happen, because unusually for most Germans, he actually read Hitler's book Mein Kampf, which sort of set out not only all his massive prejudices, but also his plans for capturing other countries in invasive and aggressive warlike plans. So he knew from the start, really, that this was not going to be a good thing. And so he was already fairly determined to be against the Nazis from a very young age. So he was also encouraged to have an international outlook. His mother was a bit of a pacifist. She had been already before the First World War, and then I suppose the experience of the First World War made her into even more of a pacifist. She lost a brother and so on. So I think many people turned into pacifists after the First World War and that terrible time. And so his parents were very keen to foster a more international outlook, to encourage understanding between countries. And so they sent him on exchanges to France and to Norway. And the children of the families he went to, they came to Heidelberg, where he grew up, and that was an enriching experience for all the teenagers who participated in those exchanges. And in 1932, he went to England for some work. When he was 18 years old, he went there for some work experience and to improve his English. And so I think those factors, the fact that he had some international outlook, that he spoke pretty good English, meant that when he applied for a Rhodes Scholarship at the end of 1932, he was successful. Surprisingly, he was successful in that venture. There are only 2 scholarships a year from Germany. There are a lot more from the States. And he was very lucky to get that scholarship. It changed his life prospects, and it also enabled him to travel afterwards. So I think it informed his outlook, and it was very lucky for him to have that scholarship. So once he finished the scholarship, he actually got a job in the States, and he became an assistant professor at Southwestern University in Memphis, in Tennessee. And he did that for a year. I think he found it quite an extraordinary place to be living at that time. But then he went back to Germany to complete his PhD, and he also did 6 months military service, which was compulsory in Bavaria. But he got He then got another invitation for a job to start in January 1939 as a lecturer and tutor in history and German, a German language and civilization at Scripps College in Claremont in Southern California. So when the war broke out, he was working there. I'll just give you, if we go to the next slide, I'll give you some pictures of just relating to his background. So this is on the top left there, which you see a picture of Heidelberg, which is a well-known, oddly a well-known city in the States, a beautiful old city. There was a song about Heidelberg, which many of Americans knew. And so for that reason, Heidelberg was very fortunate. It was the city which was designated as the headquarters for the US Army after the end of the war. So it was not bombed, which was almost uniquely amongst bigger German cities. It was not bombed. So that's where he grew up. That's where his formative years were spent. So then there on the top right, we see a picture of my father. On the far left, then he had an adopted brother who his parents died in the Spanish flu outbreak at the end of the First World War. So he was a cousin, in fact. So the second one along was his cousin. Then he had a younger sister and a younger brother who was about 9 years younger, and who was by the time he got to the States, he was enlisted in the German army, and he was already, although he was very young, he was about to go and fight in the German army. So on the bottom is a picture of my father, on the lower right with his parents somewhere in the mountains. My grandfather, German grandfather in particular, loved the mountains, and so they spent lots of holidays walking in the hills, trekking in the hills. So that's a bit on where he came from. And these are just some pictures of him when he was about 9 years old. When he was about 18 years old, he was in England then, suddenly looking a bit more like an Englishman. And then the last picture on the right is a picture taken from the Scripps yearbook in about 1940. So that's what he looked like when he was arrested. He was quite young. He was 26 years old. So just before he, as I said, he came back to Scripps he came to Scripps to teach, and then in the summer of that 1939, he took a trip to Germany, mainly to see his parents, but also to try and persuade his sister to join him in the States. He was worried about what would happen to her in Germany, but he couldn't persuade her. So he came back just after the outbreak of war. He just managed to catch the last boat out of Genoa, and he came back to New York in late September, and then to Scripps in late September 1939. So let's see what happened. What happened then? I think in 1941, in April 1941, he was worried about what was going to happen. He knew that war was going to break out, and he was worried about what his situation would be if war did break out. So together with the Rhodes Trust, he already prepared for the eventuality that he might be arrested, and collected a whole lot of support letters saying that he was someone who was anti-Nazi and reliable, and in the event of war, he shouldn't be arrested. And those letters were lodged with the U.S. Solicitor General in August 1941. But I suppose unbeknownst to him, in 1939, the FBI started to create so-called ABC lists of watch lists of those considered to be a threat to potential threat to of Japanese, Germans, and Italians considered to be a potential threat to national security. So my father, for reasons I'll explain later, was classified as A2. So A was the highest. He was deemed to be of the highest security risk. And I'll explain why a bit later. So anyway, as a result of that, so if we go, I think we could go to the next slide. I think that would be fine. So on the 8th, after Pearl Harbour, on the 7th of December, the day after, Fritz was arrested with a great many other, with about 1,200 other Germans, about 200 Italians, and 2,000 Japanese who were on those lists. They weren't all arrested that day, but it was the beginning of the process, and he was one of the first to be arrested at that point. So, and here is what you see there is J. Edgar Hoover telling the Special Defense Unit, which was responsible for the lists, had become responsible for the lists, who they had arrested in Los Angeles on the 9th of December. And there you can see my father's name. My father had been living with a fellow immigrant from Germany, somebody called Bergstresser, who was an older man, but he would have been at this stage in his 40s, born in 1898, called Arnold Bergstresser. He was also he had also had to leave Germany and come to the States, and eventually got a job in the same place as my father. And he'd been living in his household with his family. So, and they were always treated virtually as twins. So they were arrested together, they were released together, and so all of these things which occurred to my father occurred to Bergstresser as well. But if you go to the next slide, you can see here's the picture which I found in that moldy archive he took several cuttings, and this is the cutting which I thought was the most interesting. Here you have a picture in the Los Angeles Examiner reporting the arrests, and you can see they have big arrows pointing to two men who were the leaders of the part of the leadership of the German-American Bund, which was the openly Nazi-supporting, openly supporting Nazi-supporting organization in the U.S. And so there you can see him. He's right in the center of the picture with his arm raised. I think he's probably trying to put on his coat. And anyway, so he was interned with these strongly Nazi-supporting individuals. And maybe we can go to the next slide. Just some, I should say, I think I can only imagine, my father didn't talk about this, but I think it must have been a terrible shock to him to have been interned with the very people with the sort of people he was trying to get away from in Germany, and people who represented the ideology he was so opposed to. I think it must have been quite shocking to him, although not entirely surprising, that actually was happening when he tried to prevent it from happening. Anyway, just some details which I thought were sort of entertaining from the time of his arrest. So here is how much. The first one on the top there shows how much money he had in his pocket. He had $2.62, which he obviously had to hand over, because he got sent to first he got sent to the federal penitentiary at San Pedro in Los Angeles Harbor, and then after 4 or 5 days he got sent to a former immigration station converted to a detention station at San Pedro, and that's where he stayed for the duration of his first detention. So he got weighed in. I thought this was quite entertaining. He got weighed in at 136.5 pounds and 5 foot and 11.25 inches, and that's his writing there. So he was a pretty skinny guy. And one of his colleagues, I also like this little thing, which one of his colleagues from Scripps College sent him to support him, which was, "It is not so much the size of the dog in the fight as the size of the fight in the dog which counts." So I thought that was just to encourage him and give him strength, which I thought was rather nice. So if we go on to the next slide, so he was in San Pedro detention station, and he was in a way very fortunate, because he had during his time at Scripps he had developed a girlfriend, she was a student at Scripps, a graduate student, not one of his students, but he had come to know her, and so she was his girlfriend, and had been so for a couple of years by the time Pearl Harbour arrived. And so, as it happened, her father was an attorney in Los Angeles called Irving Walker, and he became very active on behalf of my father right after he became interned. So in that sense, my father was very lucky to have an attorney trying to find out what had happened to him, what was going to happen to him, and supporting his case, putting together, writing to the authorities, and putting together more testimonials about my father. So, and this is a little short extract of a letter which I thought was quite interesting about the girlfriend, I should say, eventually became the father of the girlfriend eventually became my grandfather, without giving too much of the story away just now. Anyway, here we see him writing to the FBI about the hearing my father is supposed to have. And I think this was just interesting, because it's clear that there's no real, he's trying to find out whether he can act for my father, how witnesses are going to be heard, if at all, how when the hearing will take place, how the hearing is constituted. And he's obviously finding it very difficult to get any information from the authorities at all as to the nature of these hearings. So it was the hearings were actually quite strangely constituted. It was just there were no judges involved. It was just some civilian who had been put in place to do these hearings, and but just before Christmas, my father heard that he was going to be sent to, just after Christmas, my father heard he was going to be sent along with the people you saw there from the German-American Bund. He was going to be sent to Bismarck, North Dakota. And he was very worried about that. I know it must have been pretty close because he had a ticket to a luggage sticker to take him out there at that in his memorabilia. So anyway, let's go to the accusations against him. This is what the FBI said. He was very loyal to Germany, and he said they said he offered his services to the Nazi regime, and various other accusations. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see what my father wrote down at the hearing. I won't go through all of these, but some of them were fairly minor. So that he had said at some stage he would be more useful to Germany outside than inside, and that meant that he hoped that he didn't want to fight for the Nazi regime. He would rather be able to fight against it from the outside, and then hope to return to Germany one day to help rebuild Germany. So that was the more useful accusation against him. He was, you see number 8 there is Cal Aero. He was seen near an airbase. He was reported to have maps in his car. All sorts of rather dubious sort of evidence of him being a very suspect person. The main accusation against him, and the one he found the most difficult to defend against, and the reason why he had an A1 classification, was, you see number 11 there, where he was accused of espionage, and that's because he had come to the United States in 1939. He'd happened to bump into a fellow German Rhodes Scholar who was working for the German Foreign Service, who was on a trip to the US. Officially, he was there to encourage the US to stay out of the war. But in fact, his mission was to meet up with Roosevelt and ask Roosevelt to provide support to the opposition to Hitler if they managed to assassinate him. So he was not successful in that mission, but this man, who was called Adam von Trott, did later return to Germany and did try to participate in the plot to assassinate Hitler and was hung for his efforts. But he had arrived in New York at the same time. Von Trott was traveling first class on the boat, and my father was traveling in tourist or economy or whatever it was, and but they arranged to meet at Von Trott's hotel in New York. My father got out much later and left a message in Von Trott's pigeonhole in the hotel saying everything turned out fine. I forgot the exact words here, but anyway, it was taken by the FBI as clear evidence of his some sort of secret code which he was transmitting to Von Trott, and so they regarded Von Trott as a dangerous man. So my father, ever after that, was classified as A1 so he had to argue, had to explain all this in the hearings he had, and so that was the most difficult. In spite of all these accusations, so we could go on to the next one. He had a lot of support from a great many people, including there you see in the middle, you have support from the father of Yehudi Menuhin, a famous violinist who was living in California at that time, from distinguished academics, and a great range of people. He had about 21 letters of support, which had been lodged with the Attorney General, and the Attorney General had been took a special interest in this case because, in fact, one of his cousins knew one of the people who wrote a letter of support for my father. So that facilitated his case a great deal, and that of Professor Bergstresser. And so after another month, at the end of February 1942, my father was released, along with Arnold Bergstresser, and he went back to teaching. So they went back to teaching and were welcomed back by the faculty of Scripps College. They were very welcome, but then some other things started happening. So if we go to the next slide, but not very long after they got back, there were not only anonymous denunciations of my father and Professor Bergstresser, but the American Legion wrote an open letter to the parents of Scripps College saying they thought, even though these both men had been cleared by the hearing, that they were men who were trained in the Nazi school of thought and should not be entrusted with the education of our young people. So they decided to write to all the parents, asking the parents to get these two professors taken off the faculty. So we can go to the next slide. I think it was just interesting. I found in my father's memorabilia that he took this cutting from an article by somebody called Norman Hapgood, who'd written about the American Legion in the 20s, and you can read it yourselves. But I think that it's talking about the national commander of the American Legion. And interestingly, there, back in 1927, he pointed out that Owsley, the leader of the American Legion, had also advocated taking over the national government by force if necessary. So I think when I saw that, I thought in about 2016, and then looking at it again in 2021, I thought that somehow sounded reminiscent of our current times. So that's just an aside at the moment. So if we go on to the next slide, I think that, so after that American Legion denunciation, or in spite of the fact that my father and Bergstresser had a lot of support from the students, they passed a resolution, and so did the academics at Scripps, saying they fully supported them. In spite of that, there were further denunciations, especially from the president of Scripps, who wrote a secret letter to the FBI. He said in public that he supported them. In private, he wrote a letter to the FBI. And so at the end of the day, back in the summer of 1942, my father and Bergstresser, the FBI drew up another case against them, and they were rearrested on 11th of September 1942. And so they had another hearing in the middle of September. More crazy evidence was produced, including one short story, which I know I'm pushing up against my time, but one short story which I'll repeat now, which was he'd been seen up by an FBI agent, walking up to a dam in the Rockies, a lake up in the Rockies in the mountains, with a woman, as she was described, who was his girlfriend, later to become my mother. and they'd been seen going and sitting by the side of the lake. And then my father had sent signals with a mirror, obviously Morse code signals, the agent thought, which were signaling the coordinates of this dam to another agent so that they would perhaps know how to blow it up or whatever. And when my father was still alive when we saw this evidence against him, and we wondered we pondered quite a long time what it was about. And my father wasn't a musical man, but we finally worked out he was having a picnic with my mother, with the person who was to be my mother eventually, and he wasn't a musical man, but he did play a mouth organ. So this was and they were sitting in the sun, so he was playing this mouth organ, which has a sort of shiny chrome exterior, and it was obviously flashing in the sun. But a lot of the evidence like this was like this, so hearsay, or somebody said, it's like if you're looking for a certain kind of evidence, it's like a man with a hammer who thinks everything is a nail. So I think they were trying to nail him with that. And so he was detained again. So then this time he was sent to Tuna Canyon. So we could go to the next slide. So in his time in Tuna Canyon, I'll read you he became responsible for I'll read you a short extract from what he said. While he was in Tuna Canyon, I became chief of feeding the whole camp. It was a civilian conservation corps camp from the Roosevelt area. They had a chief government supply officer and a cook who was a federal employee, but they were totally corrupt. I was called in by the commander and told to organize all the feeding for 300 people. He said, "You are a professor, you'll be able to do this." And he told me that the Japanese had sworn to kill all Germans, but they won't kill you. So my father had to take over the logistics and supply of the food, and apparently that worked very well. And as he said, he managed to keep all the detainees, about 300 of them, I think, at that point, he managed to keep them alive and pretty well. He also, I don't know whether this happened, as you can see there, he also organized a concert for the detainees by the famous violinist Yehudi Menyon, whose family he knew. And this is the rather interesting cable saying that he was when he would be coming to play. I don't know whether it ever happened, because I've never seen any other reference to this performance. So if we go to the next slide, and so here's a picture of him with his fellow detainees, which I found last year at New Year's Day, which I think is rather a moving picture. It's I think almost it's rather a sad picture. I feel almost everybody away from their families. My father was more lucky than most. His family, he didn't have any family responsibilities, but so many people who were interned had families who they could hardly see, who didn't know what was happening to them. They could only visit them for short periods behind the barbed wire. So, and I think, so this is an interesting but rather poignant picture, I think. So if we go on to the next slide, this is how my father communicated with his family. He was allowed, because he was effectively a civilian prisoner of war, the only communication he could have was via Red Cross telegrams, cables, which were limited in their length. So very, very limited communication, and many months between such messages. So it was hard. He knew his family was his adopted brother and his own brother, both of whom were killed fighting in the war. He only heard about that via this sort of communication. So that was, I think, must have been very hard. So then, fortunately, after about 4 months, he and Bergstresser being on the left there, my father being the second from the right, he was released in March 1943. He got on very well with the camp commander, Merrill Scott, and regarded the treatment which he had in the camp as very good. So it was a credit to that particular commander. So I think we could go on to the next slide. I think he was then released, but by then he'd lost his job. Then it also turned out that, I just wanted to mention this, that the Attorney General in July 1943 ruled that the classifications which the FBI and the Special Defense Unit had used were totally useless. They were unreliable, as you can see at the bottom there. He stated that they were unreliable, they should be cancelled, and should not be used as a determination of dangerousness or of any other fact. So he forced the FBI to withdraw this classification. I think that was a very good thing. So we can go to the next slide. He remained in touch with many of his fellow detainees. Here we see a Christmas card he got from one of his fellow Japanese detainees. As you know, as you will have heard from, if you've listened to any of the previous talks, and if you've read the book, unfortunately, most of his fellow detainees did not have the good fortune to be released as fast as my father. And on the right is a message, a letter from a poor merchant, a Romanian merchant seaman who got detained in Tuna Canyon as well, quite a lot longer. He did eventually get out, but he was just another one of the thousands of innocents who were caught up in this process. And indeed, one of my father's recollections was that when he was in the camp, there were quite a few Italians in the camp, old Italian men who'd arrived in the 1880s without, as Italians, they'd never bothered to acquire U.S. citizenship because they never traveled, and their sons, who were sergeants or whatever in the U.S. Army, they came to visit them at the camp behind the barbed wire. So that was one of the things he thought was rather ironic at the time. My father lost his job, but he was fortunate in, so we can just go to the next slide. We can skip this one. I think I want to get to the end. So I think, and we can skip this one. So he was fortunate to get a job as a librarian in Chicago after he was released, and he carried on in that job until, and then after the war he got a job. He actually started teaching U.S. servicemen German for their posting in Germany. They actually, in the end, got sent to Japan instead. But more interestingly, in terms of what happened, the daughter, in 1944, he married his girlfriend, the daughter of the attorney I mentioned before, and they got married in Los Angeles with 150 people in attendance. And so, and then they went back to Chicago together. They had 4 children, and my father, in later life, he did what he always wanted to do after the war, which 9 years after the end of the war, he was asked by the German Foreign Service to go back to Germany. He joined the German Foreign Service, and he spent the next 25 years in that Foreign Service, helping, above all, to re-establish good relations with the countries in Europe, which Germany had been fighting against, and where there was a lot of helping to rebuild trust in Germany. And then latterly, he was, towards the end of his career, he went as an ambassador to Portugal, just at the time when they had their revolution, and he helped them to establish their democracy in the late 1970s. So I think that's all I'll say for the moment. I should say, I can, if you want to read more, see more, a bit more about my father's life, you can follow that on this YouTube link, which I've highlighted there in this photograph, in the slide. Also, I should say, you should, if you want to find out more about Tuna Canyon, I think Carrie will probably put up a link to the website. So you just have to go to this website, tunacanyon.org, which is a very excellent website. I highly recommend it. And finally, if you're interested in the whole issue of my father was arrested, and everybody who was detained, they were detained under a very ancient US law enacted under President Adams in 1798. And that is still on the statute books in the US. And I think it's very important that it should no longer be on the statutes. And so if you are interested in supporting the removal of this act from the statutes, then I think there's a bill going through Congress, being proposed in Congress by Representative Omar just now, called the Friends Not Enemies Act 2021. So if you look that up, I think Carrie can put up a link to that, perhaps, or you can look that up, the Friends Not Enemies Act 2021. Then you can also support that if you're interested in the issues raised by this case. And so I think this, the whole story, I think it illustrates how fragile our democracies and freedoms are, and how important it is for us to safeguard the rights we have for ourselves and for future generations. So thanks all very much for bearing with me. I'm sorry I've gone a bit over my time, but I'm happy to answer any questions which you might have. Thank you. I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, I had myself muted. Thank you so much. What a fascinating story, and so many details. And I felt while we were looking at all these documents that, you know, we were just sort of discovering a little trove of facts. And it's amazing how finding old documents, you know, you talked about your father's musty file, and little details will jump out at you, and little phrases. And anyway, what a story. Thank you for telling us. While we're waiting to see if anybody has a question, I had a couple things to ask you. One, I'm fascinated about your father's family back in Germany. Were they in trouble or punished because he was there in the United States, or how was it for them?
I think it was one of his main worries. So, and it was one big problem for him because he knew he could not speak out publicly against the regime because he knew that would result in repercussions. So he could do it in private with people who he trusted, and so that's why he managed to get all those testimonials and affidavits saying that he was reliably against the. He was a German patriot, but not pro-Nazi, and it was very difficult for the authorities in the US to distinguish between the two. How could you be a patriot and not a Nazi? So it was very hard for them to understand, and I think that was true for all of those who were detained. In fact, you could be you could love Japan but not be pro what the Japanese government was doing.
Correct. We have a question here. I'm going to put it up. We've heard in other presentations how Japanese American victims of U.S. injustice didn't speak later about their experiences. Did your father talk about what happened to him during the war?
Not very much. I think he had only that anecdote I mentioned at the end about the older Italian men being visited by their sons, but what the experience was like for him, he didn't really talk about it very much. He did do a recording very late in life, and he talked about it a little bit in the film for the Rhodes Trust, which I mentioned, but during our lifetimes, it was really he didn't talk. I think it was the reason why the file lay in the cabinet for 60 years was because he didn't really want to open it up again. I think it was painful. And so he didn't talk about it very much. No.
So how did you ever learn then about your family's experiences? If your father didn't talk about it, how did you not really learn about it until more recently in your adult life, or?
Oh, we didn't learn about that period of his life. I mean, I was more interested in his experiences in Germany, and so I did ask him quite a bit about that very late in life, really, whether how it was talking at the family table, whether you could talk openly about the fact that you didn't like the regime, and you couldn't, because especially if you had school-age children. So it was a totalitarian state. You couldn't. It was a totally unfree society, and I was always very curious about how a country could turn that way, how you could have you had a democracy, and how it could suddenly turn into such a totally totalitarian state where you had no freedom at all to express yourself, to live, to travel, to do anything you wanted. And there was, of course, there was a massive, it was a murderous regime.
It was. Let's see, we have another question here. Can you tell us what your dad achieved in his later life?
Okay, well, the main thing was, as I said, going back to Germany. He worked for in the Foreign Service. He went first to England, and that was very important because he understood England in the late 50s, and he worked very hard at improving Anglo-German relations for a time. Then he went to the UN, where he worked hard at trying to get Germany back into the international arena. And above all, in the late 60s, early 70s, he worked for the German president as his foreign policy advisor, and took many trips to those countries which had the most difficult time with Germany in the war, like the Netherlands, he went with like Poland. He didn't go to Poland, but he worked on the reconciliation with these countries, which was it took a whole generation for these countries to lose a lot of their mistrust. So he did that, and then after that, he went to Portugal as German ambassador there, and he played there was a revolution there in 1974, a very left-wing revolution, and he played a significant part in helping Portugal, bringing German support to Portugal to enable them to move into a more democratic mode. They'd been a dictatorship, and they wanted to establish a communist dictatorship. So he helped that to be averted, and gradually moving Portugal into on the path towards democracy and towards membership of the EU, where it is now. Mm-hmm. So those were, I think he did quite a lot in his later life, and I think this experience in the US was enriching in that sense. It helped him to think about these things.
I have another question here. Was it typical for Japanese, German, and Italian prisoners to be co-mingled, as in the photo you showed, the New Year's photo?
Well, I don't know. I can't answer that question about all the. I think all the camps. I think certainly it was the case for Tuna Canyon, Tahunga. I'm not sure. I'm not qualified to answer about all the other camps, but I know a lot of the Germans got sent to North Dakota. There were many camps for. I think they weren't so commingled as far as the impression I have is that they weren't. So I think this was unusual.
I see. So there's actually a couple questions here about how did your father's experiences affect you and your life and your perspectives? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think he went back and became a diplomat. So I think that meant we moved around a lot. I think for myself, I had a very international upbringing, as you said at the beginning, as did my brother and sisters. And it meant that we all, in some ways, I think as a role model, I think we all we had developed an international outlook. My brother worked for the UN, but his entire short working life, he worked for the UN. I wanted to work for the UN, but then I couldn't do that in the end. But I had certainly a very international life, and my youngest one of my younger sisters, she spent her life going between India and Nepal and the US, and so she also had an international life, as does my youngest sister, who also started working in the EU. She did her doctoral thesis on Portuguese immigrants in France. So I think we've all been concerned with those sorts of issues. And that must be something to do with him and our upbringing.
Wonderful.
So I think it had a big effect. Mm-hmm.
It looks like it. Oh, there is an answer to the question that was asked earlier. Nancy Oda, who is, I believe, the president of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition. Here's her answer. At Tuna Canyon, the sleeping and eating spaces were shared. Thank you, Nancy, clearing that up. So let's see what else. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you've clearly worked in so many countries and had a great deal of experience looking at different issues in your work. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are about the immigration issues in the European Union and elsewhere. What are your thoughts on equity and inclusion of peoples, immigrant or otherwise,
Well,
in England and the EU? Do you see movement for good or particular problems? I realize this is a huge question, but maybe just a couple thoughts.
well, I think it, as it was in the with respect to especially the Japanese in the States and now in the US, in Europe, we have mainly, unfortunately, a very negative picture on immigration as well. It's a very easy thing for populist politicians to grab onto, to highlight and make a scapegoat for many other things, as was done under in Germany in the 1930s. In this case, the scapegoating, the othering of people is something which is very easy to do for politicians to gain attention and to gain support. And I think in England we have very strong, part of the reason why they left the European Union was because they said they wanted to control their immigration policy. In France, you have a far right-wing candidate vying for the presidency, campaigning on an anti-immigrant platform. All across the EU, you have very strong anti-immigrant movements and parties. The sole exception, I think, I would say almost is Germany. I think perhaps it's because it is the one country in Europe which has been vaccinated, if you want, by the experience, by the education and experience which took place after the experience it had in under the Nazi period, and the education which took place after the Second World War. So exceptionally, Angela Merkel took in 1 million people. It was a very controversial move, but she invited in 1 million migrants, which went very much contrary to the negative trend throughout most of the EU. So it's a very difficult issue in the EU and elsewhere. But I think we have to be open to immigrants. They enrich our cultures. It's what the US was built on. Every country is built on immigration. We've always had movement everywhere, and I think it's we have to address this in a fair way and just way.
Mm. Wow.
I mean, and I think, of course, you have to address it in the third countries where the immigration is coming from as well. I mean, that's part of it's to do with our own policies, and we have to address the effect of our policies on those third countries as well. So that is part and parcel of how to deal with it, but that's very difficult.
Yes, our world is very difficult today. I am thinking about the Norman Hapgood quote that you showed us. And I don't know how many people who are watching got to actually read that document, but he says, "The fascisti are to Italy what the American Legion is to the United States." And I'm thinking also of recent events in the US, but to you, in what ways and places do you see the roots of fascism alive and well and intermingling with the problem of racism in our world today?
Well, I think it's. There's a very interesting book about this in the US, describing the whole US experience, called "Behold America" by a woman called Sarah Churchwell, who is looking at groups like the American Legion, America Firsters, and the history of that, and it charts that there's really a continuous history of that sort of thinking and how it relates to the American dream in the US since the 19th century. And so I think we can see it charts a continuous line from then to the present day, and it's very obvious what's happening in the present day, that we have those tendencies very strong in the US. We have them all over Europe. Of course, we have them in other countries as well. We have them in Brazil. We have them in India. We have them where you have a strong anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment. You have them. You have a rise of anti-Semitism in many countries in Europe, and so I think these things have never gone away. I think it's a question of how you. It's ultimately a question of how you educate, and I think it's extremely important how we educate in our generations to teach tolerance, to open minds, to make sure that the history is taught properly, and I think that's the first thing dictators try and do is to change the narrative of history. You see that happening in Poland, for example. They're trying to write out the history of anti-Semitism in Poland. So I think you see these things arising all over the place. So as I said, I think we have to be extremely watchful and active in defending our rights. So these things can change overnight, as we saw, and as we've seen this year in the US, regrettably, and we could see again before too long if we're not careful. So
we could. Well, thank you. I know we could talk on and on. I am so amazed by your father's story and your own story, and clearly the legacy your father gave your entire family is really something. We've got some thank you and some comments. I'm just going to post them up for you here. And another thank you. And we are so grateful for speakers like yourself who are telling stories through the library's Book to Action program. So I am going to conclude today. Is there anything else you want to add, Conrad? We are so grateful you've joined us today.
Well, I thank you very much to all those who are listening. I don't know how many there are, but and for providing the platform, and for Tuna Canyon, the coalition, helping me so much. So thank you all, and have a good afternoon still.
Thanks. And here's a little info here on the date of the next film.
And thank you, Carrie.
You're welcome.
For your excellent care.
This has been my pleasure. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again in the next broadcast.